Okay, so I'm joined with Vaush. It's so lovely to see you,
Howdy.
Vaush. Yeah, you're very kind for replying to my email. Obviously you have a very big following, and I don't have a following at all, basically. So definitely appreciated.
No, well, I thought it was kind of prescient that you emailed me because I vaguely recall, you'll have to forgive me, I don't remember, but I believe I saw that video of yours that went viral. So when you sent me the email, like I saw it in the
Yeah,
recommendeds, you know. So when I saw your email, I was like, oh, maybe it's a constructed memory. I don't know. But the video got pretty big, so it's not at all unlikely.
it did get big. It's on like 700,000 views in 2 weeks, which obviously for someone like yourself would maybe be standard, but because I had 100 subscribers at the time, it is a bit strange. But actually, in the UK, these videos have been doing very well lately. It's a bit of a trend for people in the UK to be very unhappy.
I've noticed that. I've had conversations with them from time to time.
And you seem I do watch some of your content, and you never seem to uh hold the UK in that high regard. I will be honest. So I thought you'd be an interesting person to talk to about it.
Yeah, I mean, part of it is residual resentment because there was an insufferable period back when Sherlock and
Mm.
Supernatural and such were like, you know, primary, not cultural exports. I mean, Sherlock must have been, I suppose. Basically, if you had a British accent on YouTube, everyone thought it was the shit. And that always peeved me as somebody with a proud, California accent. So part of it's the blowback from that. Also, things have just really not gone that well over there lately. So I think that, for the most part, British people have a decent right to complain.
Yeah, you were the very first person who I heard the statistic from that the UK is basically Mississippi with the London.
Yeah, yeah, without the financial district, basically. If you
Yeah.
take out, um, here we have Wall Street, the London Exchange essentially, and everything that surrounds it, you have a very deprived country, and Mississippi is not doing well, Um, GDP or even GDP per capita is usually not a very good way of determining the wealth of an area because you have these like inconsistencies where as a consequence of the US dollar and the pound being like
Hmm.
very strong currencies, everything in our countries is immensely expensive. And then
Hmm.
you can go to like the Philippines, for example, and off of a salary that would make you poor in America, you could live, effectively like a king.
Yeah.
But that's not just the privilege of the tourist, I mean, if food is really expensive here in America, but quite inexpensive to us over in the Philippines, I mean, that's like a real material need that we're being skinflinted on.
Hmm.
Sometimes people think of it as just like, oh, it's the luxury of tourism, like, oh, you get to go to a poorer country and enjoy the fruits, but it points to a worse underlying problem, I think.
And so what do you think the underlying problems are?
I mean, I think that it used to be that wealth was built in a very obvious and very visible way.
Hmm.
Wealth was the gold you had in your keep. It was
Hmm.
the crops that you raised and took from your fields. And as time has gone on, we've more or less created the systems needed to meet the material needs of, if we wanted to, everyone on Earth. Everyone could have their food, their housing. But the problem is, once you get past a certain point of material satiation, a bunch of what previously were thought of as like essential industries become quite, unessential, right? You don't need to make new cars if everyone already has a car. You don't need to make new chairs or desks or
Yeah.
whatever you prefer if people's needs are met in those regards. So the way you get wealthy on top of the wealth that's already built is speculation, Wall Street, investment, venture capitalists giving you billions, pump and dumps. You find financial games to play that are all done on top of the real world, but the financials are like entirely disconnected. If you go back and look at the wealthiest people from 4,000 years ago, they had the most gold.
Yeah.
If you go back and look at the wealthiest people 200 years ago, I don't know, your Rockefellers or whatever,
Mhm.
they did make things, or at least they employed people who made things, right? You had your trains, your railroads, your housing. Nowadays, the wealthiest man in the world is Elon Musk. Literally, he's just a venture capitalist. He came in on Tesla after it was made. He was there at the beginning of PayPal. SpaceX benefits massively from government subsidies. What has he made slash what does he make? Well, Tesla, which is where most of his wealth comes from, doesn't make close to the total number of cars that many of his competitor car companies make, yet he's worth way more than them due to investor hype. It's just not to take like the sophomoric, it's all fake, money isn't real perspective, because
Mhm.
I mean, the economy is as real as language is. But sometimes it feels awfully fake, disconnected, at least.
I would, I mean, sort of ask such a basic question, but with regards to making things, aren't we innovative though? So we think that we've got everything, but then something new comes along that needs to be made.
I mean, innovation's great. I wouldn't want us to ever like technologically stagnate. I
Mhm.
think most people would agree, though, that some point within the recent past, there's been a cap off in a lot of fields on innovation that's had any kind of meaningful effect in our lives. When was the last time something fundamental changed about something we use? That's made an appreciable difference. Certainly, we figured out like the physical say for example like furniture hundreds of years ago. Since then it's just been a matter of making it more efficiently for
Design,
stuff
yeah.
like making it pretty, keeping trend, right? With appliances, there are appliances made back in like 1956 in America that are still functioning today. They're heavy, durable, made of stainless steel, and they'll keep running basically forever with maintenance, whereas nowadays you can make stuff cheaper but it breaks easier, so you get to buy a new one. There's nothing wrong with innovation, but innovation, at least in this system, has always been a secondary, uh, coincidental output of the real drive, which has been convincing people to buy new things. And if there's a way to do that without innovating, that's usually the cheaper way.
So what you're describing, how does it contribute to wealth inequality and the rise of the distribution of wealth? Why has this happened?
There's there are a bunch of really heady Marxist principles that relate to this, so a lot of which are more complicated that I'm capable of explaining or relaying myself. But as it seems like every time we have a boom and bust cycle, wealth is consolidated in the hands of a smaller and smaller group of people. You see this after the 2008 financial
Yeah.
crisis. Usually we talk about this in America, but 2008 ruined everyone. I mean, it hit Britain like very, very hard. And
Mhm.
you saw the exact same processes there, right?
Yes.
The pulling the rug out from everyone economically, smaller firms fail. Those assets don't just disappear, they get gobbled up by the existing firms that were strong enough to survive the economic downturn. Then by 2009, you have way fewer institutions controlling way more per each. And it works on an individual level as well. The more wealth you have, the easier it is to invest that wealth through means will give you back dividends, right? Elon Musk, perfect example, right? People made fun of him for buying Twitter at 40 billion because he
Mhm.
was forced into it. He said he was going to buy it. He
Yeah.
tried to pull out. The courts forced him. And what did that 40 billion get him? Well, he leveraged it. He turned it into a propaganda platform for the
Mhm.
person who ended up becoming the US president. Now, because of his presidential win and what that represents for Elon Musk's holdings, he's worth more than he ever was back when he bought Twitter. That 40 billion was an investment that paid off very well for him.
Yeah. He's kind of your shadow president, it would seem. Or
Yeah.
at least he's trying to be, right?
Oh, I mean, he certainly has the power to. He threatened to fund and primary the opponents of any legislatures within the Republican Party who wouldn't go along with Trump's agenda. So if he's the one calling the shots to that extent, yeah, he has more power than Trump does. And of course, it seems like he's trying to leverage that power over in Britain as well. Um,
Hugely. Yeah.
yeah,
He's
with his the Reform Party support and what he said about AFD in Germany.
he's he just comes across as so inconsistent to me. Um I don't follow him closely because I can't be bothered because he posts so much that
Yeah.
I'm too tired to follow it all. But he should be best pals with Nigel Farage, but he's decided Nigel Farage to go to war against Nigel, which just seems not on brand with Elon because someone like Nigel, I would have thought represents everything Elon wants him to, but there just seems to, I don't know, he seems fickle. Is that fair?
I think that he's fickle. I think that Elon Musk has identified a social trend that he can take advantage of very effectively, which is appealing to people's worst political and social instincts as a way of lulling them into effectively like a sleep, into a trance, while he does everything possible to enrich himself. So with Donald Trump, for instance, this was like a big hubbub recently on Twitter about H-1B visas. I don't know if you know, but in America, an H-1B visa program or an H-1B visa, that program allows people to come in and work jobs over here in the United States,
Mhm.
and their stay in the US is contingent upon that employment. So if
Yeah,
they get fired and aren't able to get work
you
again
have to go
within
home. Yeah,
a given like the time, they go home. So it's an easy way to get a very dedicated worker,
yeah.
because if they get fired, that's like a they get yoinked all the way back in many cases to India. There are a lot of very talented computer engineers in India who feel their talents would be best applied in a country like America rather than their home country. And I don't blame them for seeking that opportunity. There are a lot of very I'll say there are people who are very interested in maintaining a high percentage of white people in the United States who don't like the H-1B visa program. They think that it robs white people of their jobs. But Elon Musk came out and defended it vigorously to the extent that it got him like a bunch of hate from the very far right
Hmm.
individuals on Twitter. And because at the end of the day, all of the surface talk about draining the swamp or protecting white America, ending DEI, destroying woke, whatever, is a mechanism to get people to vote against their interests. And in Elon Musk's case, all of the wealth that is drawn towards him is wealth that does not exist elsewhere. The economy is not a zero sum game, but it's also not an infinity sum game. If some people are getting really wealthy, that's probably because someone else isn't getting their cut. Their
Hmm.
dividends, deregulation can rob other sectors of the economy, wages lowered. It can come out in a million ways, and the wealthy are better than they ever have been before at extracting that wealth.
Why do you think that Meta has removed their fact checking? Because I really thought that that was the thing that differentiated it from X, and that was I thought that actually was a very good marketing strategy because it actually makes it distinctive. It makes it more reliable in so many ways. I, I'm surprised that I mean, obviously I know nothing about it, but I'm surprised that Meta's looked at X and how difficult X has become to manage and has decided we want to go in that direction.
I think part of it is Zuckerberg wants to play catch up a little because Elon has successfully leveraged himself politically to
Mm-hmm.
be the wealthiest and possibly most powerful man on earth. Zuckerberg is probably aware of the fact that if his companies don't play ball with the Trump administration, their very biased attorney general could cause a bunch of trouble for him. I'm not saying they would, put Zuckerberg out into the ocean or that they'd even arrest him or anything, but at the end of the day, these very wealthy people, the only consistent explanation for all of their behavior is they just want to be more wealthy. All of their positions, all their beliefs are superficial coatings on top of that. They will come up with justification after justification. Zuckerberg will look like a freak robot. He'll look like a stoned out skater dude. It doesn't matter. He'll
Yeah.
argue that LGBTQ employees promote diversity at Meta and that's their strength. He'll argue that the work culture has become too feminine. It doesn't matter. What they actually believe, which we don't know, is irrelevant. Their desire to continue that consolidation takes precedent over all else. So part of it's fear of Trump, I think. A lot of it is that Zuckerberg wants to get on this very lucrative train of if I follow this hysteria that Elon Musk, that Donald Trump are riding the wave of, I can become more wealthy than I already am at the expense of everyone else. Because again, all that you can see these graphs that are like so on the nose that they make you want to cry. Like the top 1% has gotten 4 trillion wealthier this year. Meanwhile, the bottom 90% has gotten 4 trillion poorer. And it's like it's so straightforward.
Yeah. America now has a bigger wealth divide than France did during the French Revolution, I think.
Really.
Yeah, well, this
Um,
is what I was reading about. Like, and obviously they weren't very happy in France during that time. So things have got,
and we're
but
not
then
happy now either.
no, we're very unhappy. And I think in Britain, actually people are so miserable. I mean, um, and I really have seen that during the summer with the riots. I mean, obviously it's common in America for there to be riots as well, but Britain is it doesn't happen as often, but the vitriol was intense,
I
and
remember it. Yeah.
it actually wasn't resolved. Like eventually it died down because everyone was the consequences were tough. The people were put in prison, but none of the key issues have been addressed in any way at all. So I think this could happen every summer, actually, for a
No,
while.
I agree, and you're running up against like a fundamental problem here, which is that for one, obviously the people who are putting like race checkpoints or setting fire to hostels, I mean, these people are psychopaths, but it's not enough to dismiss that. You have to understand where the
Yes.
psychopathy comes from, and their psychopathy comes from very real material deprivation. Again, a lot of these people are very, very poor, or at the very least extremely anxious about their role in society, um, what direction the country is taking, because very few people are optimistic about the future of either of our countries right now. Americans don't feel good about the future of America. British people do not feel good about the future of Britain. And they have been told, usually as a product of either like independent media that tends to share in the same message, or mainstream media that has had billions put into it to repeat this, this basic message. Your problem is being caused by migrants, by immigrants, by brown people, by Muslims, whatever else. And obviously, it's a big world. There are problems caused by Muslims, immigrants, what have you, in the same way there are problems caused by any group. You can even break down all the particulars. Sociologically, you can engage in the regressive analysis. You can look at which groups tend to do X, which groups tend to do Y. It's dicey and oftentimes politically difficult, but I think rewarding and necessary work if you want to improve things. The problem is that nobody's interested in doing that. They're interested in scapegoating massive economic and social problems on, let's be real here, a relatively pithy number of migrants in Britain. It always came across as quaint to me, the discussion of migrants and immigrants in Britain causing the downfall of their country, when over here in America, we are not only the strongest nation in the world, but we also have way more immigrants.
Yeah.
And oftentimes they commit lower crime rates per capita than native born Americans, but they still get scapegoated. And the reason they're getting scapegoated, it's the same everywhere. It's the same in America and Britain. It's because, and they've been doing this for centuries, by the way. This goes back to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution and beyond. Whenever the guy on top wants to make more money, he needs to find a way to get the people below him to agree to it. If the robber baron wants to extract more surplus value from his workers, he can't look them in the eyes and say, I am doing this because I want to be wealthier. You have to come up with something. And in the old days, it was, these immigrants are lowering your wages. They're stealing your jobs. And today, it's the same damn thing. It's the exact same thing. No matter how many times it gets disproven mathematically, through analysis, through economic paper after economic paper, the myth persists because it is propagated by those same wealthy people.
Do you think it's fair to say that there's a pithy amount though? Because there are more than ever. There were 700,000 more people entered the UK last year than left. I mean, that is a lot, right? Or would
Oh,
you
oh, it
not
is a
think
lot,
so?
to be clear. It's just from an American
Yeah.
perspective, immigration has always been one of the strengths of this country. And I don't mean that in like a diversity is our strength way.
Mhm.
Take all comers, right? Irish, Italian, Germans initially, you get Chinese over in the West Coast. For the most part, these all track to big positive bumps in productivity, in cultural production. Of course, America's the cultural, you know, monolith of the world, in large part because of our immigrant groups. People have distinct opinions on Italian
Mhm.
Americans or Irish Americans. Black Americans aren't immigrants for the most part, of course. We brought
Yeah.
them over, on ships earlier than almost anyone else came, but they are so culturally dominant all around the world. You've got people in like the slums of Beijing singing hip hop. Like they've never met a black person in their life, but they're pulling from cultural threads that are created the world round. I think that's lovely. Now, it doesn't always work out that way, right? I've been critical in the past of some like specific trends in immigration, for example, like Wahhabist Muslims in many countries in Western Europe, where you have people you have immigrants from like Turkey or Saudi Arabia, and a lot of them are so conservative,
Yeah.
in a way that is like very socially disruptive and, in my opinion, indefensible. The question then is like, what do you do about that? And I think we have a really good model for it here in the United States, where American Muslims are just not that radical. And a
Mhm.
large part of that, I think, is because we don't have the same enclaves for them here as exist in, say, parts of London or Hamburg or Manchester or whatever, where I've heard, you have like very isolated communities of Muslim immigrants, and because the only people they talk to are other Muslim immigrants, like the guiding voice in their life is their like grumpy great uncle who thinks that they should establish a caliphate based out of, Paris or something, and it's like, okay. I think genuinely, I think this, and maybe I'll be called like naive for it. I think if everyone just goes outside and plays basketball within a generation or two, it'll be normal. It'll be fine. We don't want everyone to be the same, but I think the basic underlying desire to live a good life, to get along, to feel at home where you are, I think we all have that. If people are given the opportunity, I
This,
think they'll take it.
this definitely does seem to be I've always been unsure, is immigration a problem in the UK, but recently, because it's just such a complicated issue. It comes with so many pros and cons. But what I have known for a while is that um, there's the concentration of immigrants is just wrong. There's pockets where there's
That I
nobody, and
definitely
there's pockets where it
agree
feels.
with.
And a lot of YouTubers make it big in Britain by just literally doing a street view filming, like walking around a part of London, with the caption, "This is England," and
Yeah,
it
I remember. Yeah, the Lauren Southern was walking around Paris. I don't even see any French braids. Who here is French? And it was a bunch of brown people just being normal. They were just like chilling. Nothing was even happening really. I think this is how I try to think about it. Okay, America is a very unequal country in many ways. Often it's along racial lines, sometimes it's not. In West Virginia or along the Appalachian Mountain Range, for example, there are a bunch of old former coal communities. A lot of the people there are very poor. It's like a third world country over there, you know? And if you go, and I've seen videos on this, I've been to the Bible Belt myself. I haven't been to West Virginia, but I think there's like a similarity in what I'm about to describe. A lot of these people are very backwards. And I say that with love in my heart. They are not born in a good situation. So, like, it's not like I wouldn't be in that same boat if I was born in like some of these are like ruined towns, and they have like one school with no funding. Basically, you go and if you talk to these people, like demographically, where are they at? Economically, not very productive. Many of them, high rates of criminality because there's basically no opportunities, a lot of petty thieving, domestic violence. Basically, all the demographic trends you're looking at, like they're not on the up and up. And these are largely white people.
yeah.
So when you talk about these groups, what do you want to do? To me, if you go and you look at an enclave of London and you see problems there, and your takeaway from that is like, okay, fuck these problems, deport them or whatever. Why don't we do the same for those in in West Virginia? We
Mhm.
could certainly, um, and we're talking about basically the same underlying demographic problems. The difference is we have this made up preconception about like they deserve to be here, and the immigrants don't. But if that's one's position, those demographic problems weren't even what you were talking about to begin with. If it's about who deserves to be here and who doesn't, then why did the criminality matter? Criminality wasn't a determining factor in West Virginia. Why is it a determining factor here? You go back to these emotional arguments about who feels right here. But all I have to say is this, and again, I know this is my American perspective, but I imagine that after the end of the Civil War, Black Americans probably didn't feel like they belonged in a lot of cities to the north, Chicago, New York. But nowadays, New York Black people are a cultural monolith that produce, like, New York Black people probably have some of the greatest the greatest cultural stranglehold in the planet that you could imagine. The amount that they've produced and contributed, not just in terms of like music or writing, but in terms of literature and wealth, and it's a defining part of the city. If you let diversity become a core part of a community, it will enrich you beyond your wildest dreams, and you will see wealth and prosperity. But if you allow these enclaves to sit and fester, yeah, you're just going to get like angry people, terrorist sympathizers, and economic pockets. It's not the best way to handle things.
How do you embrace uh all of the pros of diversity whilst maintaining um a core set of traditions, a core national sense of nationality? Is that possible?
I think so. I think it's good to be proud of where you live and where you come from, not necessarily in an abstract, like, America should look this way, but in an aspirational, like, I want to do right by where I am. I grew up in Los Angeles. I don't really like Los Angeles as a
Mhm.
city. I still find myself reflexively proud of some elements of it. I grew up there, it's
Yeah.
important to me. But to me, like, that criticism, the idea of, we want to preserve things the way they are. Well, that will never happen anywhere. There is nowhere on earth where things stay the same forever. You do get to have a hand in how it grows, and you can choose to have a community that you love be defined by fear, isolationism, a terror of what the future might bring, or you can help shape it into something productive in line with the changing material forces in your country, and you can make it better. I notice a lot of the people who are concerned about, say, the effect of immigration on London or whatever, they seem to be more concerned about the immigration than the underlying deleterious demographic effects that it seems to have, according to them. That is to say, they'll talk about Muslim grooming gangs, they won't talk about grooming. They'll talk about Muslim rape gangs, they're not out there supporting the Me Too movement. They'll talk about pockets of economic, impoverishment. They won't talk about addressing income inequality. They'll talk about Muslim extremists. They do not talk about far right extremists. So, and I'm generalizing here, but I think there's a tendency. So we need to look beyond I think the superficial and the reactionary, like, well, how do I keep things the way they are? And instead work on how do I build them better? How do I have a hand in how they get built? And to me, reaching out to your neighbor is just a core part of doing that. Um, make sure the people who live with you, who live in your neighborhood, your community, whatever else, like, you want to be able to get along with them. I
Mhm.
defer back to New York City, as a great example of this. People from outside New York City often look in and see a lot of strife and conflict. In reality, it is one of the least racially polarized environments in the English speaking world
Mhm.
because you have so many different racial and ethnic groups that interact with each other all the time. They're neighbors. And because they treat each other often in a neighborly fashion, we all know that living in New York City is rowdy, but that's what you get with a mega city. Okay.
Yeah,
That just comes with
of
you're
course.
not going to get rid of that no matter what demographic of people you have there. New York City was rowdy back in 1776 and before. Okay. You can't change that. Um, but you can make it more homely and you can encourage the values you care about. And I think that in the case of a lot of these immigrant groups, it often comes back down to Muslims, right? I don't tolerate some of the views that those like Wahhabists have towards
Mhm.
women, wife beating, establishing a caliphate. So you can shit on all of that, but you have to give them an out, right? Because if you're saying I denounce those views and you're not giving them any reason to believe anything other than those things. You have to welcome them in and they'll see how much better your way of life is.
It's I'm glad that you're saying you don't, I mean, obviously this should be obvious, but that you don't approve of um extreme religious conservative views. Uh, but the thing is, I think a lot of people, one of the things that annoy them about the per, their perceptions of people with left-wing views is that there's a hypersensitivity with regards to equality, like fighting for equality, talking about microaggressions, etc., etc. But then they only hold that standard to the people of their country. So for example, they would hold that standard very high to white men and have an expectation that like white men are um, you know, a certain way, but then you're not allowed to criticize immigrants, even though some immigrants literally don't believe that women should vote, if that makes sense.
No, I agree. I think that there is a bit of a hypocrisy there. I think that it's mostly a hypocrisy born out of people's desire to not be confused for people making bad criticisms. So for example, right? There are like serious problems in the, I guess, many of the reactionary belief systems that you would associate with Muslim immigrants, and I think that you can fairly criticize all of those, and you can be quite harsh with criticism for either way. Like you look at like Charlie Hebdo, for example, or other examples of like outrage at criticism of Islam. All
Mhm.
I have to say is I've said some pretty mean stuff about Christians. I'd be a hypocrite if I didn't about Muslim people as well.
Yeah.
Like that, it's sorry, it just it goes beyond I guess Islamism or radical Islam and should emerge as a kind of holistic and consistent criticism of those underlying political beliefs.
Mhm.
And I think that there are problems with this on both sides. I agree. There are a lot of like dickless liberals and lefty types who will talk about equality, but they're kind of naive or maybe not naive. Maybe that's not the right word. I'd say they're like willfully ignorant of, or at least unwilling to discuss, the practical realities of building an equal world. You know, like you got to work on that stuff. A core example of this, or a great example, I think, is for example, over here in America, you've probably heard this from very intelligent people online. Black people, on average, commit a higher rate of violent crime than white people, like per capita.
Mhm.
And there's a reason for that. A lot of that is usually because there's a bunch of other like economic conditions that if you select for and balance out, like a lot of this disparity evens out. But a lot of it is a product of the drug war, inner city black kids having economic opportunities ripped away from them, and the federal government cultivating the development of gangs in those neighborhoods in such a way as to give them an easier time policing those neighborhoods after the Civil Rights Act was passed. So you create conditions for criminality. Does this mean the crime is not happening? No. There are a lot of activists within the black community who have for decades fought against gun violence
Mhm.
in black communities in America. You know, the Boondocks talks about. Have you seen the Boondocks?
No.
It's a cartoon centered on black culture in America. They talk about it consistently. I've noticed a lot of white progressives don't like talking about this because a lot of white progressives don't want to step up, you know, to the
Yeah.
podium and be like, "All right, everyone. So as we know, you know, the black crime rate." They don't want to open with that. It's just it's awkward. And I think there's you can fairly leverage or level that criticism at times when it interrupts your analysis. I think the same thing happens in the other direction too, of course. Like I said earlier, there are a lot of people who are anti-Muslim grooming gang. Then you ask them like, "Oh, do you support the Me Too movement then? Are you in favor of these like feminist initiatives to bring attention to the victims of sexual violence?" And they're like, "What is that woke bullshit?" You know?
Yeah.
Um, I guess it's difficult, and I'm not going to pretend there aren't issues with its implementation on both sides. But if you truly want Britain to be a good place, you have to envision what that looks like. And I'm not British, so I'm kind of like maybe projecting a little bit here. But when I envision like a good Britain, I guess as susceptible to culture as I am, I guess I'm imagining like post World War II construction, 1960s, the Beatles, big red buses, you know, people wearing coats in rainy fog, people being very neighborly to one another,
Yes.
eating terrible food. It's delightful. I respect what that ought to be, and you build those values out. And I guess like if you're building the ideal Britain, and somewhere in your head you're like, okay, but they have to be this pale. Their skin color has to be this pale. They have to sunburn if they've been in the sunlight for this length of time. I think you've lost the plot. You have to think, how can I build that ideal Britain out while valuing the characteristics that actually matter? Because and whether that means like leveraging direct criticisms at Muslim immigrants who come in with reactionary views, or calling out people who pretend to care about rape gangs or poverty when in reality it's just a fulcrum to attack immigrants, those are both distractions. It's not easy. And by the way, on this front, with regards to like improving Britain in these respects, and I would say over here in America as well, we are losing badly. All of these economic trends that are causing our cities to rot and decay. The lack of funding for like municipal budgets, in large part because of like stagnating property values, which are themselves caused by like the local tax base either fleeing to tax havens, like other areas that where they just build out in exurbs. You have potholes everywhere. The fire's not paid enough. The police are paid plenty, but they don't do anything because a lot of what they do is show up after a car's been stolen and say, "Oh well, that sucks. We'll take your number." It's all getting worse. And I think that there is an easy and consistent explanation for these developments that is race neutral, immigration
Yeah.
neutral. And it's the accumulation of capital on the top. None of this money is going missing.
No.
It all exists. It's just being funneled upward, taken from us.
Hmm.
And they want us to believe that it's because, I don't know, Mexicans came up from the southern border or you know, Somalis came in a boat or something. It doesn't make sense.
So you would believe that a British working class person has more in common with someone from Pakistan, their neighbor, than they do with a British person who went to Eton.
On certainly in Britain, 100%. The aristocracy that you have, and this is something we do not have, but I know your prime ministers, they all go to the same damn schools. I mean, they're of a different social class. This is distinct. Here in America, our wealthy people are just as fat, slubby, and boorish as the rest of us, you know. They have the bad taste that you would expect from, you know, any roadside dive bar guy, you know, eating waffles and drinking coffee. My understanding is that over in Britain, your upper crust is like distinct, not only in class, but in cultural etiquette, which
Mhm.
is interesting to me because it makes me feel like the British should have an easier target for their class based antagonisms. Here in America, Elon Musk, our wealthiest man, the world's wealthiest man, wears cowboy boots, ill fitting jeans, and like a cowboy hat. He
Yeah.
dresses down to pretend to be like us. Your elites still wear suits and have photos from like the 1980s of them all at a dinner party together, you know, when they were college freshmen or something. Like it seems like you have such a distinct class of people to direct your antagonism against. And I don't know, maybe that's the reason why Elon's gone after the conservatives as he has. Maybe that's the reason why he's fell in more with Tommy Robinson. You know, the true proponent of those reactionary positions being someone who exists outside of that social class.
Yeah, and you really can't fake it actually, because you can make money, but you can't be part of that world if you weren't born into it. And even your kids can't really, even if you make millions. I think it takes a lot of generations to truly be a Boris Johnson.
It's revolting. It really is. And I mean, at the end of the day, and this is so the case in Britain, I think, because the wealth is so concentrated in London, you know, and so much of it is like even aesthetically elitist, right? You've got the city of London with all of its, you know, the fancy pants mayoral bullshit. We've all seen the YouTube videos, you know, all the weird like 1,000-year-old guild traditions going on over there, and as charming and quaint as those might be, like I guess to me, as to an American, my country is only 250 years old. It's really staggering how the story is the same absolutely everywhere. Any city, any suburb, any exurb, rural areas, the same trends. Somehow the amount of money and the amount of produced goods in the world keeps going up, and yet everyone has less of it. They might have more of certain like niceties. We have smartphones now, for example, and maybe sometimes people they drive around more, they take more vacations. But in terms of their perceived economic stability, their housing, their food, it keeps getting sawn out from under them. And there is a material cause, a consistent one. It's happening everywhere in the world. The idea that it's attributable to immigration is I think laughable. I mean, it is a more unconvincing distraction than it ever has been because at least back in the late 1800s, you know, you have factory jobs, more workers come in. Okay, maybe wages have been depreciated in like a very basic supply demand sense, but we're past that now. Wealth doesn't come from the factories. Wealth comes from Wall Street speculation. And the immigrants aren't doing that, except Elon Musk, who was an illegal immigrant from South Africa, I guess, which undercuts my point just slightly, but will exempt from my defense of immigration the people who are now worth half a
It's not
trillion.
the immigrant you think of, though, is it, when you think of
No,
immigration?
no, he really isn't, which is a shame because he's done more damage to this country than any immigrant in history. And I'm sure he's going to do a lot more too.
I think so. I think he's just got started.
Yeah.
So I really appreciate your time. I'm just going to ask, how do we get this wealth back? And I'm not talking. I mean, practically, what can you do?
I think I mean there's I guess a very like easy internet answer which is you scream revolution or something but in like leaving aside I guess the easy ones like that um I think we need to take a lesson from Franklin Delano Roosevelt's governance. FDR, four-time presidential term-winning World War II president, who said, that he's essentially he has earned and welcomes the hatred of the corporations and those who oppose him. It used to be that you could, through the bully pulpit and genuine popularity, you could rise to political power in a way that contradicted the desires of global capital. Nowadays, I mean, like back then, the wealthy in America, right, were literally like the guy who owned the railroad tracks, the
Hmm.
guy with the steel foundry.
Yeah.
It was simple, material, and relatively local.
Hmm.
Nowadays, wealth is like this hundreds of trillions of like abstract wealth floating around in speculation. And the like the 2008 financial crisis, right? How does subprime mortgage speculation, a dishonest assessment of the perceived value of packages of mortgage loans, how does that gamble then collapse the global economy? I mean, it did, but then it's like, well, how? How could you build a Rube Goldberg machine that did like did it reduce the amount of steel being produced at foundries, the amount of food being raised in our farms? No, but somehow everyone had less food and less, I suppose, in the abstract, steel, and it's because now the economy is like a Leviathan. Nobody understands it. Nobody knows how to control it, not properly. The most you get are people who just scooped up as much of the speculative wealth as possible, and now they're sitting on top of it like a dragon. Elon's wealth is purported to be half a trillion at this point. God only knows how much he has outside the grid. That's just his estimated wealth based
Hmm.
on stock holdings, his shares of the companies, their evaluation. We know there are tens of trillions offshore. The only way to fight back against this is to build a working class movement that recognizes what has been taken from them, unimaginable wealth beyond comprehension, beyond anything you or I or anyone could even begin to estimate. If that wealth was applied to human need, it would be eradicated instantly. And to build that movement in a way that does not allow it to be undercut by the whims of these ultra wealthy, by these oligarchs. It sounds impossible. It is possible. They are not omnipotent. A lot of them aren't even especially bright, much in the same way that the old aristocracy was hereditary. Nowadays, a lot of these people literally just got lucky on investments. And we are capable of, I guess, building a movement sounds so abstract. People need to know what they've lost and why they've lost it.
Yes.
And no matter how much they try to pull the wool over our eyes, you can't change reality. People are getting, in a material sense, poorer, more anxious. No amount of, telling Joe Rogan to have Mark Zuckerberg on so Mark Zuckerberg can pretend that he was being cucked by Biden through like the, overregulation of Meta or whatever. They they can pull the wool as much as they want. The underlying facts remain the same. And I think people's anxieties are going to build until you start to see serious breakdowns in the supply chains, as people get angrier and more belligerent, as climate change ramps up. God only knows what kind of damage that'll have in our fragile global economic infrastructure. These pockets of resistance, I hope, will encourage more people to fight back constructively, because an uninformed resistance might as well be no resistance at all. You can't reform this by breaking it. It's too big and too complicated. If you broke this, there'd be billions dying of starvation. You know, it has to be structured. And I'm hoping for that leadership to emerge
Do you think some kind of
soon.
like unionized or people own social media has to be created for this to happen? Because I mean, when you say building a movement, obviously all that's done online now on social media. But if this is owned by people who can interfere by you know blocking whoever they like, adding ads that go against people's interests and filter into their subconscious at any time. Do you think that a new platform has to be created for this to happen?
I think it could be a new platform. It could be like heavy state management. It could be genuine bottom to top, like worker led changes to how these platforms are run. I think that we can take some solace in this, because conspiracists often believe, the cabal at the top is like omnipotently powerful. This is not the case at all. We see every day how inept our elites really are. And you take someone like Bernie Sanders, who for whom I have a great fondness. And I think that if you looked at him and you imagined, okay, the wealthy are infinitely powerful, they're malicious, they'll do anything they need to, they would have had him fall down a stair set decades ago. He's been pretty consistent in his politics for a long time. It's not like they couldn't do it. The wealth we're talking about could collapse nations. What's one guy? But at the end of the day, there is a shortfall to their control, and it's that at the no matter how powerful you are, your power is made up of abstract wealth and people, and people's hearts can be swayed. People like Bernie Sanders, even though he's spoken outwardly against the interests of both the Democrat and Republican parties, tens of millions, possibly hundreds of millions of Americans and people globally really like the guy.
Mhm.
And I just think that underlying human element, it you see this time and time again, right? You saw it under Stalin. Over time, like fomented resistance against like the brutal oppression of the Soviet state against its people led to like glasnost, and eventually, of course, towards collapse because they had some serious economic problems. You see it with the French Revolution, even though, of course, Napoleon happened, so maybe that's not the best example. You saw it here with the Civil War, I guess. You can build a system that seems like from the outside impenetrably strong. But what undid the slaveholders in the South? Well, a lot of it was just they were greedy and stupid and arrogant. They declared war on the North. They declared their secession because they were afraid of the North preventing them from building out new slave states. They could have had what they held and kept slaves for another century, maybe half. But they didn't. They made mistakes and they opened themselves up to the Civil War, to their undoing. And as so many other regimes have in the past, they collapsed. There have been thousands of despots, warlords, dictators, emperors, kings, whatever, that have, despite being seemingly undefeatable, fallen often due to like really, really mundane um, failings on their part. You failed to hold and keep the trust and loyalty of your close advisors. The people with the servants within your keep didn't like your vibe. Something always comes undone. And I think that's just history writing itself towards the underlying and consistent fact that humans like good things. We like things to be good. We want to have food, kinship, a feeling of belonging, and we will write things back towards that. Even if it takes a long time and unfortunately a lot of suffering, we do get brought back. And I'm really just hoping we get brought back in a constructive way, in a way that doesn't create something just as bad as what exists now.
What book would you recommend if you could just recommend one on this topic to encourage people?
On this topic, I guess Why Nations Fail might be too um people have probably heard that before. I can't believe I'm blanking right now on Thomas. One second. I've recommended it before. And I'm actually blanking on the name right now. No, I wasn't thinking of Thomas Kane. That's a totally different thing. It was Piketty. There we go. One second.
Okay.
You've caught me. This is a capital in the 21st century. I,
Capital in the 21st Century.
yes, this by far the best book that I've read on this subject. The shift from the economy as a rational process of material wealth, of corn, of wheat, of chairs, of ammunition, whatever, into this ephemeral speculative nightmare that no one can like manage to grab hold of. That shift, I think a lot of people underestimate how much of an effect it's had on the ability for the elites to consolidate their holdings.
Okay, thank you so much, Vosh. I really appreciate it. I'm off to work now.
Have a wonderful time. Thank you for making time before work, and I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to yap.
Oh, yeah, on my massive platform. You're welcome, Vosh.
Still
I'd
fun to
like to
yap.
give small YouTubers a chance. All the
Thank you.
best.
Take